Okay, good evening, everyone. Today is our last meeting, our last webinar in our series. And today's webinar will be covering fall pasture management webinar. And this training is being put on by the Delaware Cooperative Extension, which is a joint effort between the two land-grant universities in Delaware. So Delaware State University and the University of Delaware. So I am Dr. Kwame Matthews, and I am an assistant professor and small ruminant specialist at Delaware State University. Today's speaker will be Dr. Jared Miller and Susan Geary. So Dr. Miller is an assistant professor in the Department of Plant and Soil Science at the University of Delaware and the Extension Agronomy Specialist. He received his master's in crop and soil environmental science at Virginia Tech and PhD in soil science at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Miller is based out of the UD Carvel Research and Education Center in Georgetown. His research interests include investigating how precision ag technologies can make farms more economically and environmentally efficient. This includes drones, variable rate equipment, sensors, and yield monitors. Our other presenter is Susan Geary, who is an animal science extension agent with the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension. She has statewide responsibility for adult education in the livestock and equine areas and coordinates the livestock, equine, and dairy programming for the Delaware 4-H Youth Development Program. She has had extensive experience studying livestock production and pasture-based system as a faculty director for the Animal Science Department Study Abroad program in New Zealand and manages her own sheep, cattle, and horses on pasture on her farm in Harrington. So remember, this will
All right. So my name is Jared Miller. Thanks for the introduction. And we're going to go through fall pasture management. We have several topics, starting with assessing your pasture. We're going to cover fall fertility and soil testing, overseeding. Then Susan's going to come back in and finish it off with weed control, grazing management, going into winter, stockpiling of forage, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end.
So I'm going to start with some basic ways to assess your pasture. And this is really intended to give you an objective sort of indication of whether your pasture is in need of some changes in management techniques, or if you are in need of renovating your pasture, whether that's overseeding or a full renovation. So this is not to be confused with evaluating in terms of forage production, dry matter yield, or things like that. And so we're going to talk about just one simple way that you can do this at home easily. And I will also be providing some links in a follow-up email to some other methods as well. So we want to be able to evaluate the desirable versus undesirable species within our pastures. And sometimes I use a term, at least with livestock, that we get barn blind, and we can have the same sort of situation in our pastures where we are out there or in the same pasture, the same fields. They're very familiar to us, and maybe we don't necessarily compare them to a standard, or we're not doing objective measurements. Our interpretations can be somewhat subjective. So we want to use a method that helps us determine what plants are desirable and what are not desirable, and then what types of plants are out there. And they'll fall into three basic categories: your grasses, your legumes like your clovers, your alfalfa, your bird's foot trefoil. And then what percentage of bare soil do you have out there? And bare soil is a risk for both soil loss, nutrient leaching, and also provides an opportunity for weeds to enter into our pastures. Weeds are very, very opportunistic. So one of the methods that we're going to talk about pretty briefly tonight, and I'm going to, again, send some follow-up links, but an EPED, and this is really something that Penn State developed. It's the Equine Pasture Evaluation Disc, and it's basically a Frisbee with a little arrow on it. And so you can accomplish this at home without buying their EPED, but it's, in a way, it's a fun way of evaluating your pasture. It's a way you could get your children involved with pasture evaluation. And so this is a survey tool to help you evaluate the composition and density of the plants present in your pasture. So it's a way to manage the effectiveness of your management or how successful you may be after implementing a new practice. At minimum, you should probably be doing this at the end of each grazing season. So we're not quite there yet, but I would say into October. If you're in Delaware, at least, this is an evaluation you should be considering performing. So it provides you with quantitative information. Again, assessing your pasture quality, not intended to help estimate or measure forage production itself. The materials you need to do this are quite simple and easily accessible. If you want to buy the EPED, go right ahead, but you could use a Frisbee, a construction flag, this chart, which I'll send you a link to, a pen or pencil, a clipboard, and then if you need some assistance in terms of forage identification resources. You're going to just simply draw a W mentally using the entire length of your pasture. So you're going to start at the first point of the W and you're going to throw the Frisbee. And where the Frisbee lands, where the arrow points, and you can simply draw that on a Frisbee with a Sharpie, you're going to record what type of plant that arrow is pointing at. So is it a grass? And it can be both a desirable or undesirable grass. You're still going to record it as a grass. If you can identify the species, great, record that. If it's a legume, so a clover, an alfalfa, a bird's foot trefoil, a vetch, you might be grazing cattle and have a hairy vetch in there, you're going to record that. If it's a weed, if it's plant litter, so meaning dead or decaying plants or parts of plants, bare ground, you're going to record that. Organic matter, so that might be manure, it could be lichens or moss, and then other. And in some places that would be rocks. We don't have rocks in southern Delaware. Maybe some of our friends in Newcastle County might have a few rocks here and there, or water would fall into that other category. So you're going to complete that assessment. If you're doing a small pasture, say an acre, you're going to follow that W and throw that Frisbee 10 times and make 10 recordings. That's the minimum number of throws that you want to do. If you're doing greater than an acre, a larger pasture, which a lot of people would, 1 acre is pretty small, but you want to do a minimum of 20 throws. It's just like anything else. The more data points you have, the more solid your information and your assessments, the more accurate they are. So once you complete that, you're going to actually total all the columns, and the links that I send you will walk you through how to do that and then how to calculate percentages. But you're going to look at both what's your total plant canopy, so that would be inclusive of weeds, the grasses and the legumes. And you're also going to then also drill that down more to the desirable plants percentage. So those are your plants that have good forage value. So that's just your grasses and your legumes together. This particular evaluation doesn't break out forbs. And forbs are broadleaves. They could be desirable or undesirable. You know, I have forbs in the form of chicory and plantain that we've put into our pastures deliberately. Not everybody has that, but that's a category where this could be lacking in this particular instrument. And then you're going to calculate your percentage of pasture covered by all plants. So overall, the goals that you're looking at is you want to see 70 to 75% of your pasture covered with a plant canopy. Otherwise, you're at risk for erosion, sediment loss potentially, and nutrient loss as well. So if you see a canopy, if you come out with 80 to 90% canopy cover, you're doing really well. 90 and above is considered excellent. And then when we start drilling that down to desirable plant species, so the things that animals get forage or grazing value out of, your goal should be about 80%. 70 to 80% is considered adequate. If you're getting below 70%, you need to start thinking about changing something in your management and probably doing some overseeding. If you get below 50%, you're probably looking at a complete renovation where we're talking about, you know, burning that existing stand down and completely seeding again. And if this is a topic that interests you, we have a recording that will be available soon from our most recent webinar that covered renovating pastures more in depth. Jared's going to talk a little bit about overseeding tonight, but that recording does go a bit more in depth into pasture renovation. The other instrument that's quite easy and that I've always used is I call it the dot method, and it's very similar. Instead of throwing a Frisbee, you put a dot or a mark of paint on your boot and you walk that W and you stop periodically and look at where the paint or the dot on your boot is pointing to. And I will also send you a YouTube of a short video that was recorded by University of Maryland explaining this dot method as well. And then finally, the NRC, Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, has put out a very in-depth pasture scoring guide and score sheet. And if this is a topic that interests you, you want to do some different evaluations or more thorough evaluations of your pasture, this is an excellent resource. It's a 20-page PDF document, and it uses many more factors and more rating points. So the factors that it encompasses in its scoring are percent desirable plants, percent legumes, live plant cover, plant diversity, which is not something we've talked about here, but the more diversity in your pasture system, typically the more resilient your pasture is. So that can be an important factor. It also takes into account plant residue and litter as soil cover, your grazing utilization and severity, your livestock concentration areas. So areas like gates, water sources, shade, minerals, areas where animals tend to congregate, where we tend to have issues with soil compaction and bare soil. It will also look at soil compaction and soil regenerative features, plant vigor, and erosion as well. And those of us in Southern Delaware don't typically see too many issues with erosion, but I have seen some significant pasture erosion going on farms, especially equine operations in Newcastle County. So I will send you a link to that as well. And it's much more in depth. It's a very recent document, and there also will be a link to a PowerPoint presentation that explains their scoring system a little bit better. I think it is important to record this type of information and keep a record of it year to year. We always think that we're going to remember how things looked or how we assess them, but we all have a lot of things going on in our lives, and so that can give us a snapshot from year to year, whether we're moving forward positively in our management, or maybe we're going a little backwards and we need to change some things in our management plan.
All right, so I'm going to cover fertility. I will let you guys know that I teach fertility on campus. And so I spend a lot of hours doing this. It's hard to drill it down into minimum amount of information, so it can be overwhelming at times. But the good news is you only have to concentrate on so many nutrients in most cases for what you're going to grow. But there are 17 required nutrients that all plants need. And those include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. We often ignore them and forget about them because they're pulling right out of the atmosphere. You don't have to worry about those three, but those really dominate your plants, those three do. They're the ones we call the macronutrients, so the ones that your plants need the most. That includes nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And of those, we split them between primary, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then the secondary, which are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So you typically need almost every year you need some nitrogen unless you have enough legumes. If your soil is low in phosphorus, you probably need some phosphorus. It depends on, a lot of times in crop production, we're talking about corn, wheat, and soybeans, we pull a lot of those nutrients off to feed. If you have animals on pasture, there's a good chance some of that stuff's being recycled. The only way you really know is with a soil test. Potassium is one you probably need a little more often, especially having legumes, and potassium leach is so easy. Calcium, magnesium, sulfur. The nice thing about these is they can come with either lime or gypsum. Your micronutrients, some soils across this region might have a zinc deficiency, might have a manganese deficiency, but in most cases, you're going to control your micronutrient availability through your soil pH. Unless you just happen to have a soil that's low in micronutrients, in most cases, you don't have to worry about them, even when someone tells you that you do. So of our nutrient sources, your macronutrients up here, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, most of the time we're going to get those through either liquid or granular fertilizers. So here's a picture of some granular fertilizer right here. This is obviously from Lowe's. It's just some fertilizer for your lawn. But your dry granular fertilizers can be spread across the field. They're not necessarily the most efficient fertilizer. They're not going to get the most ground cover versus a liquid. If you can liquid apply a fertilizer, it's going to have a better spread. You do have to consider things like burning the plant tissue and damage to fields that way, but granular fertilizers are usually the easiest for most people to handle by themselves if they have the right equipment. You can typically do that yourself on a pasture, and if you don't have liquid application equipment, then you're going to hire that out. But all your macronutrients are going to come. You can purchase them through your local dealers, unless you have a smaller area, and you can buy it at Lowe's if you do something like that. But in most cases, I'm hoping that you're going to go to a local fertilizer dealer to get better recommendations and have them apply it for you if you have larger areas. The nice thing about calcium, magnesium, and your micronutrients is they are controlled by your pH, and pH is controlled by lime. So while up here with your macronutrients, you're probably going to have to find a fertilizer, find a mix, depending on which one of these you need, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and apply it. If you apply lime, you are more than likely applying both calcium and magnesium. It's pretty rare to find one that just has calcium. There is no lime that just contains magnesium. So your limes are going to come with the two nutrients you need, so you almost never have to add them to a soil. It's particularly on the East Coast. We don't have to worry about it as long as you're liming your soil. If your pH gets too low, you end up having toxic levels of some metals. It makes all your micronutrients available. The reason that you would actually lose access to micronutrients as a soil is when your pH goes too high. So if you over-lime your soil, almost all the micronutrients become unavailable. So when you are considering liming your soil, there's a reason that you want to follow the directions. One, you're going to get the calcium and magnesium that you need. And the other thing is you don't want to over-lime. If someone tells you that this pasture needs to be at a pH of 6 or a pH of 6.5, you listen to them. You don't push it to 7, because that's when you start to get back into these micronutrient issues. That's when, if your soil is low in zinc and you push your pH too high, then you're going to have a zinc deficiency. I don't see this as much in pastures. We do see manganese across Delaware. If you have a Fallsington soil and it's a wetter soil, across some of these counties, we do see a manganese deficiency. And I have seen a little bit of zinc in corn up in Newcastle County, but I don't hear about it as much in pastures, but we don't deal with them as much in Sussex. So as long as you're liming your soil, you're probably taking care of the rest of them. And that's why I say out of the 17 nutrients, more than likely the ones that you have to consider and the ones you have to worry about are these up here. These are the ones that you're going to have to think about. If you're liming your soil, you don't worry about the rest. You just manage the pH. But before you even apply any fertilizer, you need to have a soil test. You can't guess at this because, one, the pH, if you overshoot your pH, you have issues. If you add potassium and didn't need it, you wasted your money. So you always want to do a soil test. In most cases, as a soil scientist, and if you only have a small pasture and not a lot of soil samples to take, you always recommend doing it every year for me. But it's got to be a minimum of every 3 years, particularly if you have a nutrient management plan. You have to make sure you have a soil sample so you know what you need. When you're going to sample any field, if you're only taking one sample across a field, we recommend for sure that you randomly sample, because you don't know what was out in this field. If you have animals, you might end up having manure in certain spots. If someone had a lime pile out here once, if there was an old fence line, anything like that, you can have bias. So if you took one sample right here, it's not going to be necessarily representative of the whole field. So you randomly sample, you walk across the field, you collect a bunch of cores with a soil probe is the best thing. You can use a shovel. You definitely can use a shovel, but if you want consistent depths in your soil, if you want to find consistent depths, then the best thing to use is a soil probe. And sometimes you can borrow those from some people. The old extension office I was in Maryland had one you could borrow. So you just have to check if somebody has one. I always recommend using a soil probe. You can use a shovel, but we're going to get into talking about sampling at certain depths. And with a shovel, it can be hard to get a consistent depth. With the soil probe, you can usually put a marker on it and say, this is 6 inches, push it down and always get the right depth. If your pasture is like this, if you are up in parts of Newcastle County that have hills, if you're over in Maryland and you have hills, I would recommend that you split your pasture up by certain zones. Like down here, we have our wetter lower part of the field that receives runoff. It might receive excess nutrients. It might actually be more fertile. It might be higher in organic matter. You might need less fertilizer down here. That's often the case when you get into these floodplains. Your side slopes are going to erode easier. They're going to be managed differently. If you have a very steep slope that you can't even drive a tractor on to apply fertilizer, then there's no use in sometimes even sampling it. And then your upslope typically has the most leaching out of it. So if you do have a lot of different slopes on your hills, if you have a flat area, you can pretty much have one sample. If you have different areas of your field, it's not a bad idea to at least every couple years sample these separately, so you know if you need management zones, if you need to manage all of these differently. Pasture management is considered no-till, so when we're planting corn, wheat, and soybeans, especially in the past, we might have tillage equipment which mixes the soil, and you can actually see it. This is the sassafras soil, and across the sassafras here, you see this straight line. That orange doesn't work. You see this straight line running across here. That's where your plow pan might be. That's where the tillage equipment came through here and actually created this very sharp line in soil. Most soils have a very gradual change. This sharp line in soil tells you that it was tilled at one point. So the thing about tillage is if you fertilize it, if you add this fertilizer, and then you come through here and you mix it with tillage equipment, you've got an even distribution of fertilizers through that soil for your roots to make contact with. But all of our pastures, especially we're talking about fall management, are going to be considered no-till, where we do not mix the surface of the soil, which means anything that you apply to the soil, if it's not a mobile nutrient, is going to sit up here on the top. And it's going to have to move in through rainwater and through precipitation. Some nutrients like nitrogen move very easily through the soil. That's why we have issues with them environmentally, because they can leach out of your soil. Sulfur leaches through the soil easy. Potassium doesn't move very easy. Calcium, magnesium, all of your micronutrients except for boron and molybdenum will sit up here. So any fertilizer you apply will end up sitting on the surface. And that's why the recommendations for no-till soils and soil sampling are a little different, because we don't mix. We'll tell you to do a 0 to 4 inch sample. If you're growing corn, wheat, soybeans, any kind of crop where we might do tillage, we'll actually tell you to do 6 to 8 inches, because we know it might get mixed at some point, or it might have been mixed in the past. If you're looking at nutrients in a pasture, we're going to tell you 0 to 4 inches, because the lime can really mess with your micronutrients and your nutrient availability. That's when we tell you to only do 0 to 2 inches. If you're trying to do one management, do your lime and nutrients in one sample, then we'd say 0 to 4. If this year you're thinking all my nutrients are fine, all I want to know is, do I need lime? Then just do 0 to 2 inches in a pasture, because that lime, when it's added, is going to sit in the surface, and your pH is going to rise in the surface a lot higher than you want, and it's going to take it through the spring and the next year, several years, possibly to even move some of that lime down into these zones. You can actually have a high pH here from adding lime, and you can have an acidic soil down here with as many years as it takes for the stuff to move through the soil. And that's why you'll see with lime that we recommend that you do 0 to 2 inches. When you get a soil test, and this is from the University of Delaware, All the soil tests out there from these different labs will be a little bit different, but you can look for some certain things that are often a lot of them these days. And one would be, first is your concentration. You have to understand the difference between concentrations and recommendations in this little fertilizer need chart that a lot of them put out. So a lot of times you will get a number, and in this case for Delaware, you see that we have phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Pretty standard on most of your soil tests. Delaware also gives you boron, manganese, zinc, and sulfur, things that we know might be lacking in our soils. If you send your sample to Pennsylvania, to Richmond, or use AgriLab, they all might have different nutrients available for the cost, depending on what they're putting out. So you always read what the test is giving you. And they might also give you these numbers in different values. Delaware gives you what we call an index value because it's supposed to be easy to read. If your index like these are at 100, that tells me right away very easily that you don't need any more calcium or magnesium. That's the recommendation in this case. 96 and 90 are also very high. So we have these rates called index values that go from optimum and low nutrient levels. And so you'd have to read Delaware's recommendations. If you go to another lab, they might give you these values in parts per million. So if you're looking at how to add fertilizer by parts per million, you'd have to use those values. You can see we also have values in Delaware in pounds per acre, which is the more traditional way to talk about nutrients in the soil, 1.5 pounds of boron per acre. So I always recommend that whatever your soil test is, check the units, because some of those guys are going to give you pounds per acre, and some people might give you index value, and some people might give you parts per million. And if you're adding fertilizer, and most of your fertilizer recommendations are going to be in pounds per acre, you want to make sure that all this stuff is converted into the right units. Now, in most cases, if you're going to be adding fertilizer and you ask the lab to give you recommendations, they're going to tell you, you need 60 pounds of potassium per acre for this crop, and you won't have to convert it. But sometimes it costs a little bit more. It's usually just $1, I think, at AgriLab to get recommendations. But if you don't get recommendations, then you're going to look up the recommendations on your own, check the values. Make sure that this 90 is an index value and not a part per million when you're looking at your charts. So soil tests are going to give you concentrations. A lot of times they also give you a handy chart. It's supposed to be easy for us if you don't understand what level your nutrients are at. So in this case, Delaware has a low, medium, and an optimum, and then an excessive. Excessive doesn't mean it's going to be toxic to your plant. It just means there's more in the soil than your plant needs to grow. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a problem. You can have excessive nutrients. It doesn't mean they'll be toxic, versus micronutrients that are excessive might actually end up being toxic. So in this case, we're in the optimum range for phosphorus. You see it's close to 100. You see calcium's over 100, so Delaware's telling you it's excessive amount of calcium. It doesn't mean it's too much for the soil. It just means it's more than your plant needs. Excessive is a strong term sometimes. It makes it sound like it's a bad thing. It's bad if it's phosphorus because maybe it leaches out in the environment. For calcium, index value 115 just says you have more than you need. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. These tests also give you organic matter. Buffer pH is all about adding lime. The pH, this is the one you want to pay attention to, your regular pH, 6.1. So if your recommendations for a certain grass are a pH of 6, then you're fine. This buffer pH is for adding lime only, otherwise you just ignore it. We also have a phosphorus saturation in Delaware because of our environmental issues. Your CEC is how much nutrients your soil can hold, and this is sort of a base saturation is directly related to pH. You can almost ignore it in most cases if you don't understand fertility. My assumption for most of you, if you're doing this, you probably are working with someone that's given you recommendations. If not, then you have to consider looking up those recommendations and comparing to the values we have. There are recommendations out there for grasses from several universities. Delaware has some as well. Depending on whether you're starting a pasture, you have one established. And we do have the link will be available. That should be available through the email. And it is a PDF that's about 40 pages long because it has all the possible combinations we might think you have. Tall fescue by itself or a mixed grass legume. So the one I'm highlighting is a mixed grass legume. So you'd have to scroll through to find the recommendations. So here it's telling you that we recommend for a mixed grass legume to have a target pH of 6.5. Nitrogen management would be down. It's based on whether you have legumes or not, but they tell you apply sulfur when you're seeding to prevent sulfur deficiency. Forage crops are moderately sensitive to manganese deficiency. So some general highlights, but as you scroll through this, it's going to tell you what's your target pH. It'll tell you how much phosphorus and potassium to add based on whatever recommendations we had at Delaware. So in this case, what you'll see in the table is it'll tell you if your potassium has an index value of 90, it actually shouldn't recommend much potassium when you scroll through those. So if you don't know how to do that, we probably have to have a separate class on how you go through and look at recommendations. This is more of a general overview. It is a good idea to understand fertilizers and fertilizer content. If you haven't looked at this before, most of these bags that you buy, unless you're buying some kind of straight micronutrient where this says 15% here, if you've ever seen these number 10, 30, 20, this is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you see a fourth number on here, they usually put a letter on here. So you might see an S for sulfur. So your fourth number is always something that they've added to it. So in this case, 10, 30, 20 is 10% nitrogen, 30% P2O5, and 20% K2O. And that's by weight. So what it means is if you have a 100-pound bag of fertilizer, 10% of that weight is nitrogen, 30% of that weight is P2O5, and 20% is K2O. So it's a pretty easy calculation if you have a 100-pound bag. So 10% times 100 is 10 pounds of N, 30 pounds of P2O5, and 20 pounds of K2O. So let's say your recommendation for this pasture was 20 pounds of K2O per acre. Then this whole bag would have to go across that 1 acre, if you had a 1 acre pasture, to give you the potassium you need. If you needed 60 pounds of K2O per acre, you would have to have 3 bags of this. But then that puts your other nutrients out of whack. So this, a lot of times with our nutrient management, we have to balance our N, P, and K. We have to balance our nitrogen and phosphorus. We can't over-apply phosphorus. So this is a good idea if you need a mix and you work with somebody at a fertilizer dealership or company that can make you a particular mix. If you need no phosphorus, they can give you a mix with no phosphorus. It's always a good idea in any kind of crop management to understand your organic matter content, because the organic matter does break down and feed your crop, especially when it's being recycled. So in a lot of our rotated field crops, we can lose organic matter. The great thing about a pasture, which you can see right here in this pasture, is you're building up your organic matter. As your roots die, they're returning organic matter to the soil. And then organic matter has those 17 nutrients that the plant took up. It's the same thing of why manure is a great fertilizer, because it's going to have all 17 nutrients in it that the plants need, because the animals ate those plants and it gets recycled back into the soil. So if you have a good amount of organic matter in your soil, it's going to actually provide a lot of what we call the leachable nutrients. So nitrogen, sulfur, boron, well, I have them highlighted right here, sulfur, boron, and molybdenum. It will provide nitrogen, but it's a better idea to consider a legume as your nitrogen source for a permanent pasture versus organic matter breaking down, because over time, as it breaks down, they do leach out. If you have a finer textured soil in the northern part of the state, it's easy to build organic matter. If you have a sandy soil in the southern part of the state, it's hard to build organic matter. It's hard to maintain it. But the nice thing about any organic matter in your soil, especially in pastures, is it is going to build up over time. If you're doing all these recommendations, if you're keeping the pH correct, if you're keeping your grasses growing in the bare spots down, you're building organic matter, and it is providing nutrient holding and water holding and soil structure, but it's also providing all these leachable nutrients. So a lot of our soils within corn and wheat production, when we tell farmers, if you have 2, 3, 4% organic matter, you're less likely to have an issue with these 3 leachable nutrients. You probably won't have to add them as much. When considering fertilizers, you have to think about whether they have legumes or not, because legumes are able to provide nitrogen through a symbiotic relationship with microbes, particularly if you inoculate them when you're planting. Here's some alfalfa and some clover. They do provide nitrogen to your grasses, which should prevent you from having to add fertilizer nitrogen, which is a good thing because nitrogen is easily lost. It leaches easy. So you'd never recommend nitrogen in the fall unless your crop really needed it. If your legume stands low and your soil test says you need it and you want to get that crop through the winter, you can add some nitrogen. But if you're maintaining and reseeding with legumes, then we know it's going to provide and keep that crop going. And then your organic matter builds up from your roots and it keeps feeding the crop during the year. And then you only have to consider adding nitrogen as your animals are feeding on it, as you're baling it, and you need to return that nitrogen back in the summer, spring and the summer versus the fall. So legumes will provide nitrogen to grasses, but they do require their own nutrients. In particular, legumes really like to have potassium. They pull up a lot of potassium, so don't skimp on your potassium. But because of their relationship with the microbes in the soil, they like boron and molybdenum. They help with that. So these three nutrients you should consider if you have straight legumes, or if you're trying to keep your legumes stand up. You do have to look at your soil test and consider making sure those are in the soil. So what fertility should be a priority this fall? It's what do you need to make it through winter? If your stand looks good, if your legumes look good, and you take a soil test and everything's fine, you might want to consider holding off until spring, until you're going to have growth again. If you have a low amount of organic matter, if you don't have legumes, then you will want to consider possibly nitrogen just to keep that plant strong enough through the winter in case there's any kind of stress. We always see that within anything in your plant growth, whether it's moisture or fertilizer or soil compaction, the limiting factor will limit growth. So if you have low fertility and it's stressing out your plants, then they are likely to suffer through the winter and possibly not make it. So you want to make sure your fertility is up there. Don't over-apply nutrients that leach easily in the fall. So don't think, well, I'm going to put all my nitrogen out this fall. It's a bad idea. It's not going to stick around. If your plant doesn't need it and it's not growing in the winter, that nitrogen's going to leach, and sulfur is going to leach, and boron and molybdenum. So you only put out what you need. Even potassium can leach to a certain degree. So if you need a little potassium to make it through the fall, fine. But if your soil test says that you're in the optimum range, but you want to add potassium, I'd always wait to the spring on something like that. And never over apply lime on no-till pastures. As we mentioned before, it doesn't like to move down to the soil and you're likely to have an issue. So for overseeding, I know Susan said we already had a little bit out there that you could look at. It's typically a good idea for replacing legume stands. They're a little more sensitive. You probably have to look through your pasture and determine whether you want to get your legume back up. And more than likely, that's something you have to do versus the grasses. If your grasses are thinning or your weed pressure is higher, you'd also recommend, because the fall, we typically have enough moisture and you can get it out there. But one of the things you always want to consider with fall seeding is how far off are we from a cold snap? Typically, mid-August to mid-September is one of the best times to do a fall seeding. As you can see now, we've been getting rain again in August, and you need moisture to get those seeds going and germinating. But if we have a freeze come through before that plant gets established and gets its crown beneath the soil, then you'll end up losing that over the winter time. So waiting until October is not always a good idea if we're going to end up having an early freeze. So if you have an access to a no-till drill, you're going to get good seed to soil contact. If you just broadcast seed across here, you're kind of hoping that you're going to have rainfall and enough moisture to get that seed germinating and alive. If you can no-till drill it into this field, it's more likely to get down in there, be protected, pick up moisture, and germinate. Is it mid-August through mid-September, even late September? Earlier is best due to frost. Is there adequate soil moisture? If we're in a drought and no rain is coming for 2 weeks, it's not a good idea to plant seeds. And is there weed pressure at the same time? If you're gonna seed in the fall, you might have to consider an herbicide application. You're muted, Susan.
Yep, I got it. I'm going to pick it up here and just talk just a little bit about weed control in the fall. And I am by no means a weed expert. Dr. Mark Van Gessel is our weed specialist and a great resource for us and has helped us with one of these other programs in the past. But sometimes people don't realize that fall is actually one of the best times of the year for controlling those weeds that are what we term perennial and biennial weeds. So weeds like you see here, an example of a horse nettle plant, they're going to continue to come back and grow back from their rootstock. The reason why the fall is such a great time to control these types of weeds is they are busy preparing themselves for the winter. So they are moving energy in the form of carbohydrates and sugars from their leaves down into their roots their rhizomes, those kinds of structures. So they're going to take that herbicide, that systemic herbicide that we might apply to them, and move that to their roots as well, at the same time that they're moving that energy and storing energy in preparation for winter. And so as long as we're not in an August drought, you know, we've been very fortunate. We've had a highly unusual summer with pretty consistent rainfall, even through the month of August. If we were dry in a drought, those weeds tend to go dormant. And so herbicide applications would not be as effective as they would be, say, when those weeds are actively growing. But you can get more consistent control, more thorough control of those perennial and biennial weeds at this time of the year, you know, going into fall. And when we say fall, we're talking like late August and into the month of September, than we can other times of the year. So, you know, when you're doing your assessment, definitely consider, do you need to do some weed control? And we'll talk just a little bit on this next slide about how you're going to look and make your decisions. So just some things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about fall weed control, trying to decide if you need to do some fall weed control. You want to walk, just like anything else. You need to get out there in your pasture. You need to walk it. You need to observe. So assess the types of weeds that you have, assess the condition. Is it dry? You know, are those weeds actively growing and translocating nutrients to their roots, or have they gone dormant because it's not good growing conditions? And so then you need to decide, is my weed issue severe enough that I need to apply herbicide to the entire field? Or can I do some targeted spot control of some particularly bad areas that might have a higher level of weed infestation than others? These weeds, in order to be controlled with a systemic herbicide, need to have healthy foliage. So again, looking at the weather conditions, the kind of weather that we've been having, do the leaves have insect damage? Because they do need to have good foliage in order to assimilate that herbicide. And in some cases with some of these weeds, it is good to mow them if they're getting too mature, or maybe they've gone dormant. Mowing them and then waiting a few weeks and then applying your herbicide may be in order as well, to help you better control them. Just another word that we always say when we're talking about, you know, herbicides, and it's very important, is to read labels. So you want to make sure you're using an herbicide that's appropriate for the type of weed that you're trying to control. You want to be aware of any restrictions, grazing restrictions, withholding of meat or milk. And then especially if we're talking about potentially renovating a pasture through overseeding or something else, some herbicides leave residual behind, meaning that they will continue to control weeds into the future. And the label will usually tell you the amount of time that you need to think about that. Because if you've sprayed an herbicide over your entire pasture that leaves residual behind, it will affect the germination of your seed. And so reading those labels is really critical. The other thing to know is most of the common herbicides that people tend to use for these weeds, which are most often, you know, a combination of 2,4-D and dicamba, will knock the legumes out of your pasture. They will select out all broadleaves, and that will include your legumes. Now, many times we can easily reestablish clovers with frost crack seeding, or there's enough seed in the seed bank that exists in your pasture that it's not as big a deal to knock out clovers. But if you've got things like alfalfa or bird's foot trefoil, you might want to be a little bit more protective of those. And then, can we control weeds post-frost? That's sometimes a question that comes up or we get asked at the office. And as long as the weeds are actively growing, you can still control them with an herbicide after a frost, but we need to make sure that it's at least 50 degrees or warmer at that point post-frost if we want to still try to do some control. In our weed management webinar early this summer, we talked about some of the issues with applying herbicide when it's too warm and too humid, and how some of these herbicides can can actually lift and move. And so if that's a topic or a consideration, you know, if it's above 80, 85 degrees, it's getting a little iffy if you should be applying some things like 2,4-D and dicamba at that point in time. So be sure to, again, read those labels for those risks. So we're going to talk just a little bit here, wrapping up about fall grazing management and stockpiling. And I'm keeping an eye on time here because I don't want to run too far over into your evening. But one of the important things that I think about fall grazing management is you really need to plan ahead. You can't just be thinking about the immediate now of I need to get X number of grazing days, or I don't want to use a lot of hay yet. You need to look and plan ahead, because especially in our grass species, if we overgraze, so if we're grazing those grass species below the 4-inch mark, those grasses are going into a negative carbohydrate balance. They can't photosynthesize enough to make up for those loss of their reserves. Grasses tend to store their energy in those bottom 4 inches or so of the plant. And so once we start cutting into or letting our animals graze below 4 inches, we're starting to put that plant into a negative energy balance that is hard for it to recover from. And then if you add the extra stress of temperature going into winter, or maybe a fertility issue or a pH issue on top of that, this is when we start to see issues with persistence of forage stands coming out of the winter. So we need to make sure that as we're going into the winter, we're leaving enough residual plant material behind. And that has a very significant impact on future production, on our next grazing cycle, on how much grass or forage production we have next spring. There is some impact of species choice in fall grazing management, and we're going to talk a little bit here next about some of the species that tend to perform better being stockpiled or in colder temperatures. And I've included a picture here. I know we tend to have a lot of people with smaller acreages that turn into these webinars. And so I think the use of what we term a sacrifice lot. So an area that is well drained, it has good footing, it doesn't get muddy and wet. It has a vegetative buffer strip around it to catch any nutrients or sediment that may run off from it. The use of this sacrifice lot is very important, just as much in the winter, especially when we get wet ground like we tend to around here, to keep our animals from overgrazing these pastures, from damaging the forage stand, from potentially pugging the ground when it gets really wet. So pugging is when you get very deep hoof prints into the soil and can cause all kinds of issues with soil compaction and infiltration, water and nutrients not being able to infiltrate into the soil profile. So this sacrifice lot is a very important management tool, especially for those that are managing small acreage. So being able to put those animals onto that sacrifice lot during times where forages are dormant, when forages or pastures are too wet as well, or when we're in danger of overgrazing them, say in drought or in winter. So having that, being able to feed hay there is an important tool. So we're going to talk just a little bit about species and stockpiling here. So what is stockpiling? And we could do an entire webinar, an hour plus, just on stockpiling and all the details that go into stockpiling. But stockpiling, is simply the practice of accumulating forage in the field. So we're growing it and we're kind of storing it in the field versus spending the fuel and the time and the labor to make hay, for instance. Most typically, we see stockpiling occurring with our cool season perennial pastures. So pastures that have things like tall fescue and orchard grass, brome grass, our cool season legumes. You can actually stockpile a bit with Bermuda grass, but typically we don't see a whole lot of Bermuda grass being used around here unless we have people that have larger acreages that are grazing maybe cattle or other ruminants for meat production. We don't typically see it too often used if people have limited acreage. So just in terms of species performance, what species of forage plants perform best in stockpiling? And here is a list from best to worst of some of the typical cool season grass species that we see around here that can be used for stockpiling. By far, tall fescue is the ultimate standard for stockpiling for winter grazing. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically next about why tall fescue performs so well, what's great about it. Next in line in terms of performance, nutrition, growth, maintaining quality as it gets cooler and our days get shorter, meadow brome would be next, followed by orchard grass, and then timothy. And one of the worst species for stockpiling is reed canary grass. And then our legumes, if we want to talk about those quickly, Alsike clover is one of our best, bird's foot trefoil and red clover, white clover, and alfalfa does not perform well stockpiling because once we have a freeze, it typically drops its leaves and you're left with only stems. And so some of these other legumes at the top of the list tend to keep their leaves longer and maintain quality longer. So go ahead. Tall fescue. So tall fescue tends to have more growth in the fall, and believe it or not, its greatest nutrient value is in the fall going into the winter. Tall fescue is not a sod-forming grass. It's a clumping or a bunch grass, but it can get so dense that it can provide a pretty stable, pretty solid base, almost as good as a sod-forming grass. So it's a bit more weatherproof. It tolerates hoof pressure and comes back from that much better than some of our other cool season species like orchard grass, for instance. I think the real key to stockpiling tall fescue is what is that regrowth period after your last graze or your last mowing as you're trying to build that stockpile in the field. And you may have seen there's a graph that's been floating around for years where you have quality of forage on one axis and you have yield on the other axis, and axis of the graph. And so what you're looking for, again, just like when we talk about hay quality, is where are those two lines crossing on that graph? So we want to look at where we can maximize yield but still maintain quality. And typically that's in the 60 to 75 day range, meaning 60 to 75 days after your last grazing or your last mowing is when you're going to have the best quality, but also the best maximizing yield. You could go out 100 or 120 days of regrowth, but you're going to start to lose protein at that point. Your digestibility of that forage is going to decrease. And so, one easy way to remember it is the shorter the rest period after your last grazing or your last mowing, the higher the quality, but you're going to have less tonnage, less yield. One thing to think about or be aware of is what does that tall fescue stand look like when you start your stockpiling? And so you want to make sure that it's pretty much all at the same stage of growth and development. It should be very even. You don't want it to be rough, real mature in certain areas and overgrazed in other areas. And so you may need to mow it off in preparation to start your stockpiling. One interesting thing to note, and tall fescue still to this day I think gets a bad rap because of the endophyte issue, and a lot of people don't realize that we have these new improved novel or friendly endophyte varieties of tall fescue available that do persist well in stands as long as they're managed well. But ergovaline is the toxin that the endophyte fungus that infects the old Kentucky 31 variety of tall fescue. Ergovaline is that toxin that the endophyte fungus produces, and that is what actually causes the negative effects that we associate with grazing livestock and horses on tall fescue. You know, the issues with longer pregnancies and the issues with milk production and some of those other things, fescue foot and all of that. Once tall fescue has been through a frost and even into the winter, the ergovaline levels in an endophyte infected tall fescue actually decrease over time as we go into the winter. And so tall fescue is really unique in that its quality improves the colder the weather gets, to a point. So it's a great forage for stockpiling and being able to continue grazing later into the season after other cool season pasture species have gone dormant. You will notice if you have a pasture of, say, orchard grass and a pasture of tall fescue, that orchard grass is going to turn brown and go dormant much sooner than a tall fescue pasture will.
I would like to say thank you to both our presenters, and I would like to say thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.